Welcome to our second episode of Too Close to Home, a video series in which we select a handful of patrons at our Too Close to Home tier, ask them for their hometowns, and then dig up any unsolved mysteries, true crime events, ghost encounters, stories or videos, and any other unsolved mysteries to talk about. If you would like your hometown featured in a video, then please check out our Too Close to Home tier over on Patreon, either by clicking the link in the description or in the comments section below. Now, without further ado, let's get into the second episode of Too Close to Home. Cessnock Hunter Valley in Australia. Cessnock is a city in the Hunter region of New South Wales, Australia. It's located next to Australia's oldest wine region and is most commonly known for its wineries and coal industry. The city and the surrounding area is no stranger to urban myths, ghosts and tragedies. It's also the home of Lucas Lennon, one of our patrons. So sit back, Lucas, and enjoy what we have found about your hometown. The bizarre case of the body in the bush. On October 2nd, 1985, 22-year-old Susan Eisenhood visited her brother to wish him a happy birthday. He then dropped her off near her home in the Newcastle suburb of Mayfield, that is located about 45 minutes drive from Lucas's home in Cessnock. 12 days before the visit to her brother, Susan had discharged herself from the Mandala psychiatric facility. Soon after the visit to her brother, Susan was reported missing. This was the start of an enduring mystery and botched murder mystery that to this day still remains unsolved. 9 months after Susan's disappearance, on Sunday, July 12, 1987, police were alerted by a family who had found a human skull in Kiwarak State Forest. The family were looking for garden mulch off a dirt track called Joe's Cutting. Investigators searched the area and located the rest of the skeleton scattered over a 50-meter area. It was believed the body was dumped naked, as no clothes were found and there was no indication of a grave. The only leads were pieces of jewellery found nearby. Within a few days, police were convinced the remains belonged to a strange and unkept girl who had been reported 2 years earlier and was believed to have been living rough in the forest. But this theory was quickly dismissed when forensic results indicated the remains belonged to a male youth, aged between 16 and 19, probably of Asian descent. After the discovery, extensive investigations were carried out that led to nothing. For the next 11 years, the case remained unsolved. Then, as part of a cold case review, a second autopsy was carried out on the body, and a huge mistake was discovered. The remains were actually female. By now, the case was so cold that there was little or no chance of finding any new information. Then in 2003, Susan's nephew Dylan, who'd never met his aunt, but knew the story of her disappearance, began using the internet to search for more Lloyd information, and discovered a listing related to an unidentified skeletal remains of a young woman at Possum Brush that had been placed on the missing persons index by police in 1998. The teenager told the family that they asked for a DNA comparison to be made. It revealed that the remains were in fact Susan's. For nearly 20 years, Susan's remains had lain unclaimed, with her family anguished over where she was, and now finally they could afford her a proper burial. However, 35 years on, detectives still have no idea how Susan got to where her body was found, a 2-hour drive from her home in Cessnock, although serial killer Ivan Millard has been cast as a possible suspect, although nothing has been proven. Susan's case is now one of the cases to be re-examined by specialist detectives using cutting-edge technology in an attempt to finally solve the mystery and get justice for Susan and her family. Mysterious Big Black Panther sightings. For years, there have been legends and occasional witness reports of what appear to be black panthers lurking in many areas of Australia, including the Hunter Valley region. In December of 2015, Hunter Valley resident Andrew Lua was driving in the Meadowy State Forest when he caught sight of a large feline-type creature in his vehicle's spotlights. Mr. Lewis said the creature walked out of the bush and got stunned momentarily by the car headlights before running into the bush. He described the creature as cat-like with big green eyes, between 2.5 and 3 feet tall, and estimated that it weighed around 50 or 60 kilograms. He was adamant it was not a normal domestic cat. The report attracted the attention of conservation biologist Terry Domico, who encouraged people to contact him with their sightings. Soon a string of similar sightings were reported to Terry. Local resident Mr. Biggs claimed in June 2012 he found a paw print in sand in his backyard that he believed belonged to a large feline, possibly a panther. The paw prints were as big as his hand. Mr. Briggs claimed he showed photos he took of the print to National Parks and Wildlife Service officials, and they were astounded. He said he also believed the big cat was near his yard around Christmas that year, after his son's dog, a Staffy, sensed something and he came to the door looking petrified. He said Staffies are not frightened of anything, but we couldn't calm it down. Jack Tesler of nearby Cardiff also came forward and claimed in January 2016 he took a plaster cast of a large paw print found in mud while four-wheel driving off Old Maitland Road. His own research of the print led him to believe that the Lake Macquarie area of Hunter Valley is a hotspot for big cats, and he believes it's a perfect place for a panther to survive. Chris Trees, a mountain bike rider, claims he saw a black panther at Mount Sugarloaf in the Hunter region. He said he spotted a big black cat drop from a red gum tree that was easily the size of a Rottweiler. It had a big black bushy tail and the head shape of a cat. The latest sighting was on January 1st, 2020, when Bev Fraser said she will never forget looking down a fence line on her Hunter Valley property and spotting what she described as a very big puma-sized cat sitting on her fence post. Mrs. Fraser, who lives on the outskirts of Maitland in New South Wales, said she had not been able to get closer than about 120 metres before the animal sensed she was there. After this latest sighting, the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries launched an investigation. They had previously concluded that there is still nothing to conclusively say that a large black cat exists in New South Wales, despite more than 500 accounts being logged across the region. It's been claimed that during World War II, American soldiers brought panthers and pumas to Australia as mascots. They were also available to buy on the black market. Others believe big cats have escaped from zoos and circuses over the years and escaped into the wild. The theories and sightings were backed up in May 2001 when a Freedom of Information request revealed the state government had been keeping a secret file on panther sightings all along. Tartu City, Estonia. Tartu is an old university city of southeastern Estonia on the Ema River, and the original settlement of the Tarbatu dates from the 5th century. The area has a somewhat dark past and has suffered devastating damage over the years. In 1775, the once prosperous city was devastated by fire and was largely rebuilt in classic style. It suffered heavily again during World War II. Today it is thriving and is the second largest city of Estonia after Tallinn, and is often considered the intellectual centre of the country because it's home to the nation's oldest and most renowned university, the University of Tartu. It also happens to be the home city of one of our patrons, Anu. The Human Sausage Factory. After the Second World War, there were tales of people mysteriously going missing and suspicious meat products starting to appear for sale in the food markets around Estonia. This sparked a gruesome rumour about a human sausage factory. The rumour was started when a milkmaid who worked at a nearby farm had come to the marketplace in Tartu to sell milk. She claims she was enticed to a building by a man who said his friends wanted to buy milk. When she entered the building, she saw human body parts, hair, and children's clothes in the basement. Realizing she was in danger, the milkmaid escaped and ran screaming back to the market to tell all what she had witnessed. The girl then led the locals to the building, and they peeped through a door and saw heaps of heads and what looked like a sausage factory. The authorities were called, and it was established the factory was making sausages from the human flesh of the missing people, many of whom were children. One of the searchers allegedly found the head of his daughter still with a pink ribbon tied in her hair. The full horror of what was happening at the factory was revealed, and the friends and relatives of the missing feared they had inadvertently eaten their relatives in a sausage. Alexander Andreevich Rubal. Estonia has its own notorious but little-known teenage serial killer. His name is Alexander Rubal, and his region of terror happened just a 2-hour drive from Tartu, in the city of Tallinn. Rubal was born in Ukraine, but moved to Tallinn with his family. He committed all his murders while still a teenager, and went high after inhaling gasoline vapors. Rubal committed his first murder on the 19th of September 1997, aged 16, when he killed his disabled neighbour. In his testimony, he told investigators that at the time he had an overwhelming desire to kill someone, and picked his neighbour as his first victim because he knew he could not mount a defence. In his second killing a few weeks later, he was aided by his father, who suspected a man called Mr. Pavlov of having an affair with his wife. Andrei stabbed Pavlov 4 times, and his son finished him off by pretending to help him into an empty room within the house, before strangling him and throwing him out of the 3rd-floor window. Andrei was convicted as an accessory to the murder and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. The following year, Rubal stabbed another person to death at the Strumi beach. A few days later, on February 2nd, 1998, he decapitated Vladimir Ivanov with an axe after randomly stopping him in the street and asking him for a cigarette and money for gasoline. He then went on to murder another neighbour, and a few days later, a further person. His final murder was on the 4th of June 1998, when he killed 15-year-old Alice Sivas by slitting her throat. Rubal was eventually caught and convicted of 6 murders, although there was possibly more, and was sentenced in 1998. As a minor, he was sentenced to the maximum punishment allowed by law, 8 years of imprisonment. He was released from Tartu prison on the 8th of June 2006, and is believed to now live in Ukraine. Glasgow, Scotland, UK. Glasgow is an ancient city oozing with history and soaked in the stories of its ancestors. It's the biggest city in Scotland and the 3rd largest in the United Kingdom. Present-day Glasgow is a vibrant hub of activity and Scottish metropolis rich in music, art, sport, food, culture, education, finance and commerce, not forgetting its many pubs and distilleries. All to be enjoyed by our patron Laura Woods, who lives there. As you would expect with such a colourful past, there are a few gruesome tales to be told about your city. Peter Manuel. Peter Thomas Anthony Manuel was born in New York on March the 15th, 1926 to Scottish parents. 5 years later in 1932, the family returned to Scotland and set up home in Motherwell. But by the age of just 10, Manuel was considered a juvenile delinquent and served his first term in custody at age 15 for sexual assault. In 1946, Manuel attacked and raped a woman, for which he served a further 9 years in Scotland's Peterhead prison. After his release in 1953, he moved to Glasgow, where his parents now lived. Manuel soon settled into life in Glasgow and met a girl, Anna O'Hara, and was due to marry her on the 30th of July 1955. However, Anna called the wedding off when she found out about his criminal record. On the day Anna broke off their engagement, a furious Manuel took out his anger on 29-year-old Mary McLaughlin, whom he abducted and threatened to kill by decapitating her. She was able to escape him and his sexual advances, and was the only later victim to testify against him. The following year, on the night of the 2nd of January 1956, Manuel followed 17-year-old Annie Nealons onto a golf course in East Kilbridge near to where he was working at the time, where he assaulted her and battered her to death with an iron bar. As a known sex offender, Manuel was questioned about the murder, but released without charge, after his father provided him with an alibi. Although Manuel later confessed to Anne's murder, he was not convicted of it. On the 7th of September 1956, Manuel broke into the home of Marion Watt in the High Burnside district of Glasgow. Marion, 45, her sister Margaret, 41, and Marion's 16-year-old daughter were all shot in their beds. Marion's husband, William, was initially charged with the killings, but was released 2 months later for lack of evidence. He had been away on a fishing trip on the night in question. Manuel then served an 18-month prison sentence for burglary and was released in November 1957 to resume killing. His next victim was 36-year-old taxi driver Sidney Dunn, who was murdered on the 8th of December in Newcastle-on-Tyne. Less than 3 weeks later, 17-year-old Isabel Cook was abducted as she went out to meet her boyfriend at a nearby bus stop. Isabel was raped and strangled, and her body was buried in a field, and would only be discovered when Manuel pointed out the spot to the police. In the early hours of January 1st, 1958, Manuel broke in to the Uddingston home of the Smart family, where he shot Peter and Doris Smart and their 10-year-old son Michael. Manuel then stayed in the house for a week, living on the Smarts' food and looking after their cat. When he left, he stole cash and the family car, and even gave a lift to a policeman looking into Isabella Cook's death. Manuel was arrested after he used the stolen money in a bar, as the notes were new, which was unusual back then, and the barman called the police. While in custody, Manuel confessed to 8 murders and was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution took just 8 seconds to carry out, and 24 seconds after the drop, Manuel was certified dead. He was the second last prisoner to die at Glasgow's Barlinnie Prison's gallows, before capital punishment was abolished in the UK in 1965. Glasgow Necropolis Ghost. The Glasgow Necropolis is a sprawling graveyard perched high on a hill overlooking the city and dating back to 1832. It contains over 3,500 monuments scattered over a 35-acre site that is full of magnificent architecture, sculptures, and fascinating stories relating to the 50,000 people remembered there. However, do not be fooled by its beauty, as it's easily overshadowed by its notorious reputation as being one of the most haunted places in Scotland. Legends of ghosts and vampires that roam the site have circulated for years, but perhaps the creepiest story associated with the necropolis involves a vampire. A beast that is commonly referred to as the Gorbals vampire, and has been described as being 7 feet tall, monstrous, and containing a mouth full of razor-sharp iron teeth. In the 1950s, 2 children were murdered, and the vampire was the main suspect. Local children were so upset by their deaths that one night in 1954, hundreds of them descended upon the Glasgow necropolis. They came armed with weapons and ready to fight and kill the vampire they believed dwelled within Glasgow's most famed cemetery. After police heard what was happening, they broke up the gang and sent the children home. Soon after the incident, horror comic books that had arrived in Scotland from the US were banned from being sold to minors. This was to try and dampen the children's overactive imaginations about the vampire. Apart from vampires, many people also believe that ghosts roam the Glasgow necropolis. Frequently, visitors report seeing apparitions roaming the cemetery. The most common one is that of a woman in white. She is often seen gliding through the tombstones in the early hours of the morning. In addition, many have claimed to witness the statues adorning the tops of graves move their facial features as though they were living beings. Others have heard the distinct sounds of whispering when no one is around, and picked up on disembodied voices throughout the sprawling, creepy graveyard. San Francisco, California. Every corner of San Francisco has an astonishing story to tell, from the days when giant mammoths wandered through what is now North Beach, to the gold rush delirium, and the vibrant, prosperous city it is today. San Francisco is the 13th most populous city in the United States, and the fourth most populous in California, with nearly 900,000 residents, one of which being Fania Young, a valued Patreon member. So let's take a look at a selection of stories from San Francisco. Serial killers. San Francisco has had more than its fair share of serial killers. Perhaps the most well-known is the Zodiac Killer, an unidentified perpetrator who taunted the police by sending a series of letters and cards to the local press. The letters included complicated cryptograms relating to his murders, although only one has been definitively solved. It's thought he was responsible for at least 5 murders, but claimed himself to have murdered 37. Then there is the Golden State Killer and the vile Richard Ramirez. However, we're going to look at a lesser known serial killer known as the Doodler, who is likely still alive and has yet to be identified. The Doodler, also known as the Black Doodler, is an unidentified serial killer believed to be responsible for up to 16 murders and 3 assaults on men from the LGBT community of San Francisco. The attacks happened between January 1974 and September 1975. The Doodler was given that nickname due to his habit of sketching his victims before he attacked them. All of his victims were men he met at gay nightclubs, bars and restaurants, and his consistent method of killing by stabbing to the front and back of their bodies in specific locations linked the same man to all the murders. The suspect is described as a man between 19 and 25 of African descent. He is about 6 feet tall with a slender build. Initially, police believed there could have been as many as 3 different perpetrators during early stages of the investigation, but eventually evidence pointed to just one man. The Doodler's first victim is thought to have been 49-year-old Gerald Earl Kavanaugh, a Canadian-American immigrant whose fully clothed body was found on January 24, 1974, lying face-up on Ocean Beach. It was determined Gerald was conscious at the time he was killed and had attempted to resist his killer because he had self-defense wounds. After this murder, a further 4 men were found dead in similar circumstances, all believed to be openly part of the LGBT community. The Doodler's last victim was Harold Goldberg, a 66-year-old Swedish-American immigrant who was discovered on June 4, 1975 in a decomposed state. It's thought there are many more murder victims and survivors of the Doodler's attacks, but because at the time there was a stigma attached to being gay, they either feared outing themselves or their families refused to acknowledge the link. Even when police held a young man they believed was responsible for attacks on 3 surviving victims, they were unable to proceed with criminal charges because the victims did not want to out themselves by testifying against him in court. At the time, officers stated that they strongly believed that the man in question was responsible for the crimes, but he was never tried or convicted because of the survivor's refusal to appear in court. To date, the suspect never has been named publicly or apprehended, and very little information is available about the crimes. Today, the case is still open and the killer is still at large. With developments in DNA technology, the police are hoping that one day the Doodler will be apprehended and brought to justice. There is currently a reward of $100,000 for information that would lead to the arrest of the killer, and a revised sketch has been circulating of what he could look like now if he is still alive. It was a sad sign of the times that in the 1970s there was still so much stigma surrounding the LGBT community that many still felt the need to hide their sexuality. The ghosts of San Fran. Let's lighten the mood and look at the reputed ghost that haunts some of the most well-known locations in San Francisco. There are actually so many that we are only going to look at a few briefly. And let's start with Hotel Union Square. Hotel Union Square was built in the early 1900s and is situated in the heart of San Francisco's shopping district. Back in the day, it was a favourite meeting place for Dashiell Hammett and Lillian Hellman to conduct their love affair. Both were successful in their own right. Hammett was an author of detective novels and short stories. Among his creations are Sam Spade and Nick and Nora Charles. Lillian was a dramatist and screenwriter known for her success as a playwright on Broadway. Both of them were also known for their controversial political views. It was an open secret that the pair were involved romantically, and room 207 at the Hotel Union Square was where many of their activities happened, and it's said that Lillian never vacated the room after her and her lover's death, and still haunts guests that stay there. They have reported giggling and strange goings-on in the room by an unseen presence, as well as ruffled bedsheets, and many believe Lillian frequently returns to the room in spirit, hoping to meet up with her illicit love again. The Chambers Mansion. The Chambers Mansion is a Victorian-looking building with a mixture of Gothic and Tuscan detailings on its outer walls. Not a lot is known about its history, but it's thought to have been built for Richard Craig Chambers, who made his fortune in the silver mines. However, it seems it was not a happy house. Allegedly, Chambers lived there with his two nieces who hated each other, and when he died in 1901, they inherited the property. Unable to live with each other, one sister built a house next door and moved into it. The other, Claudia, remained in Chambers' mansion and met a grisly and mysterious end. She was found cut almost in half. Her relatives maintained that she had suffered a farm implementation accident, but others suspected that she was murdered by her neighbour and sister who lived next door. Nowadays, visitors to the house often report seeing flashing lights from the upstairs window of Claudia's former bedroom, and many believe that Claudia still resides in the house long after her unnatural death. The Presidio Cemetery. There is always something spooky about a graveyard, although the Presidio is a little different in many ways. It's a peaceful haven of beauty and serenity, full of the remains of not humans but beloved pets. Most of them are the animals and pets who dutifully served the military families who lived at the Presidio when it was an army post. However, anybody who's had or got a pet will know they are fiercely loyal, and it's long been said that the ghosts of some of the pets linger in the grounds near their final resting places, waiting faithfully for their owners. Other visitors have reported seeing the apparition of a soldier walking through the grounds, hoping to be reunited with his former companion. Albuquerque, New Mexico. When we think of New Mexico, the first thing to come to mind is the Roswell UFO, when allegedly something large, round, and made of a metallic substance crashed in the desert on July 2nd, 1947. To this day, mystery still surrounds the incident. However, New Mexico is a huge state, and we are just going to concentrate on the city of Albuquerque, a city that is around a 3-hour drive from Roswell, and is also the hometown of our patron, Cynthia Brown. Let's take a look at some tales around Albuquerque. West Mesa Murders. In 2009, 11 corpses were found buried in shallow graves in the desert above Albuquerque. The case became known as the West Mesa Murders. It took the Albuquerque police weeks to uncover all the bodies, which were scattered over a 92-acre swath of land owned by a home developer, and nearly a year to identify the remains. All of them were women between the ages of 15 and 32, and most were Hispanic. They had gone missing between 2001 and 2005. 10 of the 11 victims were known prostitutes and drug abusers, a fact that police pointed out early on. One victim was 22-year-old Michelle Valdez, who had been 4 months pregnant. It was the most horrific murder case Albuquerque had ever seen. While serial killers are not uncommon in western United States, New Mexico's largest city had never dealt with one before. Police promised the families of the victims that solving the murders was a top priority, and initially that seemed to be the case. Officially, the cause of death for all 11 women was homicidal violence, but the truth was, medical examiners and forensic experts couldn't determine how the victims had been killed. No witnesses came forward, and there was virtually no forensic evidence at the burial site, which meant that there was nothing to tie the victims together except their shared grave and high-risk lifestyles. Investigators assembled a crack team of detectives, bringing in FBI profilers and working with law enforcement agencies around the state to try to figure out how the bones of 11 women had wound up in the desert However, it seems, considering the magnitude of the find, there was very little publicity. Even after police released photos of the victims in 2010, there were few leads, and the police seemed quite secretive about the investigation. The biggest break came from a private investigator, George Walker, after he started receiving cryptic, taunting phone calls and emails from someone claiming to have information about the killer. But even that lead went nowhere. It later emerged that in 2007, 2 years before the crime was uncovered, an Albuquerque reporter discovered that the city's lone missing persons detective had compiled names of 16 prostitutes who had disappeared in the city between 2001 and 2016. The first sign there may be a serial killer in the area. Eventually, 9 of those women were identified at the West Mesa site. The whereabouts of the other 7 remain unknown, leaving open the question of whether the killer might have had other burial sites and whether he may still be out there killing. Police in Albuquerque are still investigating the West Mesa serial killings, known officially as the 118th Street homicides, although few details have emerged in recent years. Sadly, there are still no official suspects, and Albuquerque has largely forgotten about what was once known as the city's crime of the century. The Albuquerque Press Club. The Albuquerque Press Club building has a long reputation as being one of the most haunted places in Albuquerque. Originally it was built as a family residence in 1903, when it was called the Whittlesey House. Over the years it passed into various hands, and at one time many of the rooms were rented to people who were convalescing from 2 nearby sanitariums. Today the building serves as a nightclub and restaurant, and the staff and visitors are often disturbed by strange sounds and odd occurrences. High-heeled shoes are often heard walking across the bar and lobby areas. The piano sometimes plays of its own accord, and strange voices are sometimes heard. The apparition of a woman in black shawl that the staff call Mrs. M has appeared to numerous people over the years. The Chemo Theater. The Chemo Theater is a historic landmark in Albuquerque. It was built in 1927, but like most theatres, it has a tragic past. In 1951, a 6-year-old boy named Bobby Darnell was killed when the boiler in the basement exploded, demolishing part of the original lobby. It is this boy, wearing a striped shirt and blue jeans, that is often seen playing on the lobby staircase. He is also known to play numerous tricks, such as tripping the actors and creating a ruckus during performances. To appease the spirit, the cast hang donuts on the water pipe that runs along the back wall of the theatre behind the stage. Rancho Cress. Not actually in Albuquerque, but about 15 miles north of the city in Cress, lies an old hacienda that was built in 1801 by Diego Montoya. The peaceful home was, at first, a delightful residence surrounded by orchards. However, all that changed in 1883 when Louis and Luisa Umberto purchased the property. 5 years after they moved in, disaster struck and a bloody shootout occurred. Louis discovered that his wife was having an affair and moved out of the hacienda, promising to return and kill both her and her lover. Well, in April 1898, he did return and shot his wife. An armed posse soon surrounded the hacienda and gun battle ensued, and Louis was also killed. However, due to the scandalous circumstances of the couple's death, they were not allowed a proper burial in the church cemetery, and their remains were interred across the irrigation ditch to the west of the building. Today, the restless pair apparently continue to make their presence known at the restaurant that the hacienda now is. Reported activities include items moving on their own, the sounds of disembodied voices, and the appearance of a woman in 1800s era clothing. Others have also heard the sound of midnight parties in the older parts of the building. So that's it for this episode of Too Close to Home. We hope you've enjoyed, and a big thank you to the 5 patrons featured in this video for supporting on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.